If you don't know me, my name's Paul. The lady that was on the platform earlier, Deb's my older sister. Deb was born in Good Hope, but my younger sister and I were born in Brazil, in the northeast of Brazil. And where we grew up, the village we grew up in, had no secondary school. So what we did was we came to boarding school in England. There was a state school with a boarding house, and we came here for boarding school. And then when I was 18 and I finished school, I went back to work with my parents for a year, back where I grew up. And here I am with some of my boys. That was us just getting ready to go off to a football tournament. Anybody here a fan of football? There's actually fewer people this morning than I thought. That's a good number. Where I grew up, there wasn't loads to do, so we spent a lot of time playing football. We're actually out the front of our church there, and behind the church there was a sand football pitch. The reason it was sand is there wasn't enough water to keep a decent grass pitch going. So there we are. I think that was a tournament as well, home game. And an annoying thing was on that pitch was, if you imagine the goal over on that end, so you've got a goal this end, the goal that end, we often didn't have a net to put on it, and some of the lads could hit the ball so hard, and behind it was just an open field, so the ball would go for miles. And so, like, sometimes you'd be playing with a guy that was just like a machine, and they would pelt this ball, and it would be like 5 minutes before you could play again because the ball. So what I decided to do was I planted a line of trees along the back of the football pitch, with the idea that as the trees grew, there'd be less long walks down the field to get the ball. And so I planted these trees, and because it's so dry there, anything that you've planted, you have to keep watering. So I remember I got up early one morning, and it's hot, so I just had my shorts on and my flip-flops. I'm half asleep, and I walk down, and I'm watering these trees with a watering can. I can remember it. I just had a watering can, a pair of shorts, flip-flops, and I'm there half asleep watering the trees. And I looked up, and I suddenly realized that I wasn't on my own. And what had happened was men that looked a bit like this. So these are Brazilian police. I don't know, maybe about 20 of them. I looked up, and what I realized was the area I was in had been surrounded, and they were positioned all around, and they were jumping fences. And all around me, these big guys with big guns like that had kind of encircled me. I'm just there with my watering can. What's going on here? And different to the police here in the UK, police here in the UK is a very different ballgame. I knew that these guys were trained killers. They would have been in situations where they were up against gang members who were armed with guns, and these guys will have killed people and were highly trained killers. I also knew that the police in the area I grew up in had a reputation of corruption, and so any one of those guys, or all of them, could be involved with criminal gangs. They could have cousins in criminal gangs, or they could be getting a little extra money on the side from the gangs. And so I knew that you can't trust these guys. Something else I knew is that the police where we grew up could make young men disappear, and you'd never hear of those young men again, and there would be no accountability. Does that make sense? So they could make people disappear, and there'd be no accountability. And I looked up, and these guys were all round, and this one, I remember, they were all in camouflage, and there was one dressed in black like that, and he was clearly the leader, such a sharp guy, and he was calling me over like this. So I'm walking over with my watering can. So is that an offensive weapon? And I went over to him, and he started asking me these questions. And I found myself feeling calm. Despite the danger of the situation, I felt calm. And I'd been at boarding school, and you're probably disappointed in me, but I was in a fair number of fights at boarding school, often with older lads. So I knew how to handle myself in a fight, but do you think that was any help to me in that situation? No, these were big, trained killers. I knew there's nothing I could do by myself. But I felt calm for 3 reasons. The first reason is that I knew I hadn't done anything to upset anybody. I hadn't done anything illegal, and I hadn't done anything to upset anybody in a gang. And so I knew there was nothing, I don't think they're after me. Second reason I felt calm is that I owned one of these. You tell what that is? It's a passport, but essentially, what passport is it? It's an old one. It's a British passport, United Kingdom, Great Britain, and Northern Ireland. So the difference between me and my mates in the photo is that I held one of these. And it's the sad reality that for me, if they did something to me, they would face a real headache that they wouldn't face if they made one of my mates disappear. Does that make sense? As a citizen of the United Kingdom, as that being part of my identity, I knew I had a level of security that my friends didn't have. And so I knew I could be a little bit more calm. The third reason why I was feeling calm, I'm going to come to a little bit later on. It turns out that these guys were looking for a very dangerous man who had been exactly where I was just an hour or two before. And they were out looking for him. But that's the story for another time. And that's the end of the story. We all love stories, don't we? We enjoy listening to stories. And I've been working my way through the story of Genesis. And Genesis covers quite a long period of time. Starts off with the creation of the world. There's Adam and Eve and how God relates to them. And then there's Noah and his family and his descendants and how God relates to them. And then it focuses in on one of Noah's descendants, a guy called Abram. And God's been making promises to this man, Abram. And Rob touched on that, and we're going to see a little bit more of that today. And he's been making promises at different times over many years. The last time I spoke, back in the summer, we looked at Genesis chapter 16, and Abram and his wife Sarai have been trying to have kids for years, but they haven't been able to. And so they decide what they're going to do is they'll get Sarai's servant Hagar, who's an Egyptian lady, and Abram will have children with her. And you can listen, it's a complicated situation. You can hear that talk online if you want. And so Abram and Sarai's servant Hagar have a child, Ishmael. And then at the end of chapter 16, they've got this son, Ishmael, and then 13 years pass. And we arrive at Genesis chapter 17. If the clicker will work. I think it's just given up. Oh, no, there we go. So we get to chapter 17, and Abram is 99 years old. He's an old man. And the whole of chapter 17 is a conversation between God and Abram. And what I've done is I've divided, so far I've been working through chapter by chapter and doing whole chapters at a time. I've divided chapter 17 in half. It's quite a long chapter. So tonight's going to be the first half of it, and then I'll finish it off the next time I speak. As you listen to this chapter, like with a lot of Genesis, you'll notice that some of it is strange to our ears. Genesis isn't trying to fit in to 21st century Britain. It has a wildness and a strangeness to it, but we can learn a lot from it if we pay attention. And my friend Isaac's going to come up, and I'm going to raise this mic stand because he's pretty tall, and he's going to read the first half of Genesis chapter 17 to us. As an extra challenge, if you want one, try and spot the word that gets repeated 11 times. Over to you, mate.
So this is Genesis 17. So when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said, "I am God Almighty. Walk before me faithfully and be blameless. Then I will make my covenant between me and you, and I will greatly increase your numbers." Abram fell face down, and God said to him, "As for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will become Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations. I will make you be very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants, and for the generations to come, to be your God and the God of your descendants after you. The whole land of Canaan, where you now reside as a foreigner, I will give as an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you. I will be their God." Then God said to Abraham, "As for you, you must keep my covenant, for you and your descendants after you, for the generations to come. This is my covenant with you and your descendants after you, the covenant you are to keep. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You are to undergo circumcision. and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and you. For the generations to come, every male among you who is 8 days old must be circumcised, including those born in your household or bought with money. They must be circumcised. My covenant in your flesh is to be an everlasting covenant. Any uncircumcised male who has not been circumcised in the flesh will be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant.
Thanks, Isaac. Thank you. You swapping over the clicker, Deb? Thanks. Thank you. Did anybody spot the word that was repeated 11 times? Covenant. Well done. Strong. Where are you going to go with this, Paul? Covenant. Yeah, that's right. There it is. That's the whole of the chapter, and I've highlighted the word covenant where it comes up. It comes up 11 times through the chapter. You might be thinking, what is a covenant? Here's the Cambridge Dictionary definition. It's in law, a formal agreement or promise between two or more people. When a covenant is made, then to break it is unjust. There are different definitions of covenant. That's just the one from the Cambridge Dictionary. But actually, chapter 17 of Genesis is a lot like a legal contract. And like a legal contract, at the beginning, God lays out have you ever read a legal contract? At the beginning, you'll lay out who the different parties are. And that's what God does. He lays out who the parties are. He says, I am God Almighty. The Hebrew is El Shaddai. You might have heard that before. I am God Almighty. And then the other person in the covenant contract, you are Abram, but you're not going to be called Abram anymore. Your name will be Abraham. Just a little explanation there. Abram means exalted father. Abraham means father of many. And there's probably some of you here tonight where the meaning of names is like a big thing for you and you love that stuff. And it is interesting and it is important, but I'm really sorry, I'm not going to go that deep into the names tonight. So if that's your thing, I do apologize. But it's worth saying that names and their meanings are important in Genesis and through the whole of the Bible. But what God's doing here is he's saying who he is in relation to Abram. I am God Almighty. And he's saying, Abram, he's giving him a new identity. You're going to become the father of nations. And then, like with a legal contract, God lays out what each party is going to do in that covenant. So he starts off with what God's going to do. As for me, this is my covenant with you. And he says a whole load of things. I'm going to make you fruitful. I'm going to make nations of you. Kings will come from you. It's going to be an everlasting covenant that goes on forever. And I'm going to give you this land. And part of it's the land where Rob and Liz are headed, the land of Canaan. And you could sum it all, if you were to sum it all up in one word, God is going to bless Abraham. And then he moves on. So he says, as for me, this is my covenant with you. And then he says to Abraham, as for you, here's what you've got to do. And what is it that Abraham and his descendants have got to do? Anybody? You're allowed to say it in church. It's all right. Circumcision. There we go. If you're wondering, we had a bit of a debate with my family as to whether everybody at church would know what circumcision is. So in case there's any doubt, here's the definition from the Cambridge Dictionary as well. Circumcision is to cut the protecting loose skin off a boy's or man's penis for medical, traditional, or religious reasons. There you go. What did you learn at church this evening? And one of the old ladies at church this morning came up to me and said, I don't think I've ever seen the word penis in church before. That's like, oh dear, I'm sorry. So verse 11, you are to undergo circumcision, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and you. So circumcision is a sign on the outside of something real between God and Abraham. And I didn't know this before studying for this chapter. But actually, this isn't a completely new idea. They actually reckon that the people in that area at that time, a lot of people were actually practicing circumcision. And so the Philistines, who come in the story quite a bit later, they were seen as a bit dirty and unusual because they didn't practice circumcision. But God's using it as a symbol, as a sign of the covenant contract between him and Abraham's descendants. And I don't know if you noticed this during Isaac's reading. Our minds in the West, in the 21st century, we're very conditioned to a way of thinking that focuses on the individual. So we're thinking about God and Abraham. But I wonder if you noticed how much of that passage involved the generations to come and the descendants. So look at this. This is the whole of the chapter, right? And I'm going to highlight now all the times that it says something to do with the generations to come or descendants. Just the word descendants, there you go. Just the word descendants comes up 5 times. Generations to come. It's important to say that this covenant contract isn't just for God and Abraham. It's something that's going to go on and on and on for generations. Also interesting to highlight that it wasn't just for Abraham's own immediate family, that people who are not Abraham's offspring, foreigners that were going to come into the tribe, were to be included in this covenant as well. Just going to highlight that. So there's quite a lot going on, and you might be asking, okay, Paul, what's all this about? What's the main point of this passage? I think the main point isn't circumcision itself. It's that God is making Abraham and his descendants into a people, a tribe, under his covenant. And circumcision is a sign of that reality. If I was to summarize what we've just looked at in one sentence, it would be this: they're to be a people in covenant with God, passing on the blessing to the next generations. That's to be their story. And I don't know if you're aware, but this is actually, you might think this is just a weird Bible passage that we've read, but this is actually a big moment in human history. You don't have to be a Christian to believe that. This is a big moment in the way that human history then develops. What do I mean by that? A few months ago, I was in Birmingham New Street Station, and you'll all be aware of what's happening in the news with Israel and Palestine at the moment. And we're all aware that the city that we live in, we have a lot of neighbors and people in our community of a Muslim faith. And that at the moment there's big tension between the Muslim community and the Jewish community because of what's going on in Israel and Palestine. You're all aware of that. I was in Birmingham New Street Station, so in Birmingham, and I saw a man walking through the station who was clearly dressed as a Jew. He had his skull cap on, had his ringlets. He was dressed consciously as a Jew, and I found it quite moving because he wasn't just being silly. He knew the weight of what he was doing, but he was choosing to do it anyway. He knew that he was part of a bigger story, something much bigger than himself, and that his identity in that story was stronger than the fear he must have been feeling. Does that make sense? Who I am is more important than what I'm afraid of. Who my people are is more important than what I'm afraid of. And actually, Jews and Muslims trace their tribal roots back to this story. I don't know if you're aware of this, but the Muslim and the Jewish communities both practice circumcision because of what happens here in this covenant contract. Whew, that's a lot of information. And all of that brings us to a really important theological question, one of the most important theological questions, which is this: what on earth does that have to do with us here in Sutton Coldfield? I enjoyed that photo. My Uncle Bryn, who's got special needs, said I was a bit immature for having that. He said, why have you put a picture of a dog on there? What on earth does all that have to do with us? If we zoom out, so if we look at the Old Testament as a whole, covenant is something that comes up quite a lot. So already in Genesis, God's made a covenant with Noah, and then he makes actually a couple of covenants with Abraham. And then further on in the story, he's going to make a covenant with Moses. And then way further down the line, there's going to be a covenant with David. So God is a God who makes covenants. There's all these covenants. And then right towards the end of the Old Testament, if you read the book of Jeremiah in chapter 31, there's a whisper of something new that's coming. It says this in Jeremiah 31. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors. Something new is coming, and it's going to be a blessing for the whole world. And then at a specific point in history, a man called Jesus burst on the scene. And Jesus is a very important person in human history, whatever your beliefs are. And he's an important person in human history for a whole range of reasons. And one reason why Jesus is such a big deal is this. Put your hand up if you were born in the United Kingdom. That's quite a lot, probably a higher percentage than this morning. Put your hand up if you were born outside the United Kingdom. I was. That's good. One reason why Jesus is such a big deal is that he has made a way for all of us in this room, all the guys that were here this morning, people all around the world. We, all of us together, have become something new. We have become a people under covenant with God. People from all kinds of ethnic backgrounds. We have become a new tribe because of what Jesus done. It says this in Hebrews chapter 9. Christ is the mediator of a new covenant. So back to our picture of the dog. How does that work? How do we become covenant people? Well, if we go back to what Isaac just read, Genesis chapter 17, how do we, people from all kinds of ethnic backgrounds, become one people in Jesus? It says Abram was 99 years old. So the Bible makes it clear here that God makes this covenant with somebody who's an old man. And I got told off by the older people this morning. It's a hard thing to say delicately. He didn't have a great deal of potential. You know, if you were looking at his CV and you looked at his date of birth, you probably wouldn't employ him on a 5-year contract. Trying to not be offensive. I got told off by a lady with a stick this morning. I love that. I love that God chooses a man who's 99 years old to start something new with. And it's the same for us. You might have been taught to think highly of yourself, but in reality, when we stand before God, I think all of us, when we're honest, we know we're frail. We're frail human beings. None of us has that much potential, really. God's given us potential. God's given us giftings, but when we stand in front of God, what do we have to offer? And then God appears to this old man and he says this, walk before me faithfully and be blameless. So God calls all of us and his standards are high. God has high standards. Walk before me faithfully and be blameless. So what does Abram do? Does he say, okay, God, I'm a pretty good guy. I'll sort that out for you. No problem. What does Abram do? Does anyone remember from the passage what he does? Anyone? Does he say anything? That's it. Abraham does this. In other words, he says nothing at all. He falls. It says Abraham fell face down. In other words, God, I can't do that. Lord, I have nothing to offer you. Just an old man. What can I bring to you? Only you can save me. And for all of us, when that's our posture in front of God, God looks away from our mess, our frailty, and he sees what Jesus did in our place. And Abraham falls face down, and God says, as for me, this is my covenant with you. And for us, when that's our posture before God, God, I've got nothing to bring you. God looks away from our mess, and he sees Jesus, and he brings us into his covenant people. Not because we deserve it, but because he wants to. And so what's our end of the deal? Back to the dog. What do we have to do? Do the men have to get circumcised? I made a joke this morning. We've got a few doctors here, and I've brought along some scalpels. So no, don't worry. But this question was a big deal. If you read the New Testament, I imagine at some point if you've read the Bible and if you've read the New Testament, there's a lot of debate in the New Testament about exactly this. So a bit of context. The Jewish people who knew they were the covenant people realized that Jesus had brought something new and different, and that people from all kinds of backgrounds were coming into God's people. And they were saying, that's brilliant, but you're God's covenant people now, so if you're a man, there's something that we need to do. You need to get circumcised. But actually, what they missed is that this is a new covenant. Something new's happened. And so you get things like this in Colossians 2. It makes sense of a lot of what's in the New Testament. Colossians 2 says this: when you came to Christ, this is talking to people who are not of a Jewish background. When you came to Christ, you were circumcised, but not by a physical procedure. Christ performed a spiritual circumcision, the cutting away of your sinful nature. For you were buried with Christ when you were baptized. And with him you were raised to new life because you trusted the mighty power of God who raised Christ from the dead. So in other words, when we come to Jesus with our lives and ask for him to come in, he does something new with us. You're circumcised, but not physically. He does something in your heart that changes you. And actually, there is an important outward sign for all of us that we're now in covenant relationship with God. Did you pick up what it was? It's a big clue here. It's baptism. And it's for everyone, not just for the boys. It's for the ladies as well. And actually, as I was studying this passage, I think this is what grabbed me the most, is that us lot here in this room together, along with people all around the world, we are God's covenant people. We're a tribe. We are a people group. That's our identity. Donald touched on this last week. It's a lot bigger than my personal friendship with Jesus. We're now a tribe that's called together to serve. We're not inward looking. We're to bless the world. And we're not to do that on our own. We're to bless the world together. And we're to pass that blessing on, like Abram, we're to pass that blessing on to the next generations. We're to be a people in covenant with God, passing on the blessing to the next generation. That's to be our story. And you might ask, okay, what does that look like in my life? What can I do this week as a result of that? And what we're going to do now is I've picked out 7 characteristics of covenant people. So these are things that we aim to be as God's people. And we can all do at least one of them. And this is really important. We're not at school. So your aim here isn't to remember all 7 things. If I was to think about it now, I could probably bring them all out of my head. And I spoke on this morning. But your aim's not to get to the door and remember all 7. I'm not going to have a nice summary slide with what the 7 things were. That's not the point. The point is that there'll be one of these things that sticks out to you and you think, I can do that, that's important. So just take one of them, grab hold of one of them. Does that make sense? Not trying to memorize them all, just pick one out that sticks out to you. Here we go. We'll finish with this. 7 characteristics of covenant people. Number 1, we're a called people. Just like Abram was called by God, each one of us, each person in this room, has been called by God to leave our old way of living and follow him. Not all of us have obeyed that call yet, but all of us are being called by God to leave our old way of living and follow him. And if you're not sure, if you're sat here this evening and you're not sure if you're part of God's people, God is calling you. God's calling you tonight to come. And everybody in this room at some point has to make a decision on that call. And one of the biggest joys for us as a community is when people say, okay, God, I want to leave my old way behind and I want to follow you. So if that's you tonight, if you're somebody who isn't walking with Jesus yet, come and talk to one of us after the service. There's going to be people you can pray with. It's the best decision you can make with your life. So we're a called people. Have I answered God's call? And then number 2, we're a baptized people. For Abram and his family, the sign of being in covenant with God, everybody did it. All of the males were circumcised. And Jesus makes it clear that his followers, as an outward sign of what's going on in their heart, is that we get baptized. He doesn't say, if you feel like it. The Bible says, believe and be baptized. So if you haven't yet, us British people, we're not good at being direct, but if you haven't been baptized yet and you're a follower of Jesus, get baptized. It's not that complicated. And if you're wondering what you need to do to get baptized, it's really simple. Don't leave it for a week down the line because you'll forget or you won't feel like it. If you know that you're a follower of Jesus and you're not baptized yet, come and talk to Deb after the service and say, I think I need to be baptized. If you're waiting for a sign, this is it. The Bible says get baptized, so do it. So we're a baptized people. Have I been baptized? Number 3, we're an engaged people. What do I mean by that? A tribe is a place where everybody has a part to play, whether you're 99 or a small child. This here isn't like a cinema where you turn up to watch. Everybody's got something to contribute, so get involved, be a part of this people. This is your tribe, not your cinema. And if you're thinking, well, I don't know anybody yet, they keep banging on about this thing called living the life. Why don't you come and get to know some people on Wednesday at 7 p.m.? This isn't your cinema, this is your tribe. How can I contribute to the common good? Then question 4, we're called to be a blameless people, and none of us are there yet. God says to Abraham, walk before me faithfully and be blameless. And so it's for all of us, if we're part of God's people, it's for all of us to say, am I walking this week faithfully with God? And is there anything in my life that doesn't line up with him? And we're all on a journey with this. And part of being in a people group is that we have a responsibility in this to each other. Am I bringing shame to God's people by the way that I live, by the way that I act out there? It says this in Psalm 69. In fact, this verse really grabs me. Lord, the Lord Almighty, it's a prayer. May those who hope in you not be disgraced because of me. God of Israel, may those who seek you not be put to shame because of me. And that can be our prayer. So we're called to be a blameless people. What needs to change in my life this week? Number 5, I love this photo. We're a people who love each other. And again, we're on a journey with this. Jesus said really clearly, by this, everyone will know you're my disciples, you're my people, if you love one another. If I'm part of God's covenant people, how can I be a blessing to them this week? How can I show the world how precious this thing is to me? Way more precious than being British or any other kind of identity. The most precious thing in my life is that I'm a part of this family. So how can I show that in the way that I love people? How can I show love to my tribe? How can I forgive people that have done me wrong? How can I hold back from complaining and try to encourage people instead? And I said this morning, it's really important, this one, because some people in this room are going to dark, difficult places this week, and they need their family to encourage them here. Does that make sense? Some of us are going to hard places where we'll be discouraged and we'll be battered, and so we need that love from our family. We love each other, not so that we can be a nice, lovely Christian community, don't they? Aren't they lovely? We love each other so that we can be ready to be a blessing to the world outside. That's why we have to love each other, and that's how the world knows who we are. Be loyal. Be encouraging. How can I love God's people better this week? And then number 6, just like Abram, we're to be a people who bless the next generation. Abram was called to pass that covenant down generation after generation, and it's the same for us. And it's not just children and young people, it's who is the new person who's new to this family, and how can I be a blessing to them? We're celebrating soon the life of Val Inchley, an older lady who lived for Jesus her whole life, blessed the younger generation. She's passed down things to us, and now it's our turn. How can we bless the next generation? So, who is new to God's people, and how can I bless them? With my example, with my time, with my money, with my prayer. And then the last one, number 7. We're a people who know our identity. Abraham and his family knew who they were in relation to God. They're a covenant people. That Jewish man I saw in New Street, he had no question in his mind as to what his identity was. I started off talking about the police, and the police in the UK are very different. There they are, carrying somebody off. You can see the boot in the middle. The police know, they have a very clear visual identity. They know who they are. They know who their people are. If I'm struggling, and we live in a time when people don't know who they are, so many people don't know what their identity is, what their tribe is, and so we look for it in all kinds of places. But how can I find strength in being part of God's people? It says this in 1 Peter 2. Powerful verse. You are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. You're a chosen people. Tuesday morning, early Tuesday morning, I hadn't had a great night's sleep, and there's been a bit of illness going around, hasn't there? I was feeling a bit run down. I was just feeling generally quite low, and I was in my work van, and I had to get to Maryvale Road in Bourneville. You know Maryvale Road in Bourneville? And I was driving from Sutton, and I looked at the sat-nav, and it said 30 minutes. I thought, oh, bang on, I'll arrive 2 minutes late, but that's all right, I might make it up. And I set off, not feeling brilliant, and got to Erdington, and the traffic started, and I was sat in traffic, and you could just see people in their cars getting angrier and angrier, and it was crawling. It was meant to take 30 minutes. It took me an hour and 15 minutes to get there. I've never been so late. And I was just sat there in traffic, and it was a grey day. It was cold, wasn't it, earlier in the week? And I was feeling low. And what I wanted to do was, I wanted to turn the radio on and listen to Radio 4 just to drown out the depressing voice in my own head. Has anyone ever been there before? Where you're just like, I just want to listen to something. Feeling low. Maybe it's just me that's a bit depressed. So Tuesday morning, I'm sat in traffic. And then I started thinking, I've been studying this chapter for a while, and I thought to myself, if this stuff doesn't make a difference in your life, Paul, why are you bothering talking about it on Sunday? And I thought, I'm part of a chosen people. And straight away, what I noticed was I'd been sat like this, driving, and I sat up a bit straighter in the driver's seat. I'm part of a chosen people, a holy nation. And I felt my shoulders come out. And the traffic was still terrible. I was still really late. And I still didn't feel very well. But something in me just started to change. I am part of a tribe, and I'm going to see them all. A load of them. I'm going to see them on Sunday. And I am part of that family. And I just felt different. And I went from feeling low to, and I said this morning, I started driving like someone who's part of God's covenant people. And I don't know exactly what that looks like, but part of it, I think, is that you, if you're on the main road and there's someone trying to get in, then you flash them and go like that. I'm part of God's covenant people. Come in. Come into the covenant road. The circumstances were exactly the same. It was still a cold, grey morning, and I still felt ill, but my posture changed. Does that make sense? I'm part of a people in covenant with God, and I can act and feel differently when I remember who I am. We're a people who know our identity. Do I know my identity in God's people? And the reality is, we live in a time where a lot of people are sad and lonely and stuck in a sad cycle of individualism, where a story is something on Instagram that's all about yourself and only lasts 24 hours. But we're part of a story that has lasted millennia. We're part of a tribe that's strong and has history and has changed this world for good. And we follow a leader and a king who's so kind and gentle. There's been nobody like him in history. We're connected to our ancestors in the faith, people like Val Inchley, people like William Wilberforce. And we're connected to the next generations, and we're connected to each other, and we're part of something much bigger. And so how does that change how we stand as we go into this week now? I started with that story about the police in Brazil, and I said there were 3 reasons why I felt calm. First one was I hadn't done anything wrong. Second was I got a British passport. The third was that I was baptized when I was 12 years old, and I knew from a young age that I was part of God's people, and that Jesus, if he wanted to protect me, he could. But even if I came to harm, even if I was to die, my future was sure in him. And that being part of God's covenant people meant I didn't have to be afraid of some corrupt police, even though the situation was scary. And I just finished with this. The police here in the UK, they have a very clear visual identity. And if it's helpful to you, if your brain works how mine does, next time you see a police officer or a police car, think to yourself, they know who they are. Do I know who I am? And the funny thing was, I was getting ready to say that this morning, and I drove out of the car park. I was just driving out of the car park where we live in Erdington, and a police car came in front of me. And my first thought wasn't, what's my identity in Jesus? It was, is there anything wrong with the car? Have I got my seatbelt on? And I thought, for goodness sake, I'm about to talk about this. And I forgot, literally in that moment. Anyway, Jesus, thank you for what you've done. Thank you that all of us here, we used to be not a people, and you've made us a people in you. Before, in our old lives, we found no mercy, but in you we found mercy. Thank you for what you've done in our lives, and would you help us to represent you well this week? For your glory, Jesus. Amen.